Thanks for coming, everyone. Really excited. This is obviously my first in-person conference in just about 2 years. Probably spoken to more people in the last 2 days than I have in the last 2 years combined. It's a little overwhelming, but I'm happy to see everyone. I'm happy to be here. Hello, welcome. The Talmud actually says that there's poschim b'chvod achsanya. There's you're supposed to start off by thanking your hosts, and I would really like to thank RubyConf and the Ruby Foundation for putting together this conference, Valerie for hosting the track, and of course, in a sense, my audience are my hosts also. You came here to listen to me, so I'd like to thank each and every one of you who are here now in person, those of you watching at home, those who will be watching the recordings in the future. It really means a lot to me, and I thank each and every one of you personally. We're all familiar with the trolley problem. We have a trolley barreling down the tracks. That if you do nothing, it'll head right over to 5 people who are tied onto the tracks. We won't get into who tied them on there and what they're doing there. And you're the operator. You can turn the lever that'll take it away from those 5 people, but that'll kill another person who's on another branch of the track. And this is a problem that comes up in many different variations by many different philosophers and ethicists. And we're really heading about as fast as the trolley. We're heading towards a time where these questions aren't theoretical and they're not going to be decided by humans, where the trolley is going to have to be making those decisions and other ethical and moral decisions. And we really need to start developing frameworks, how to think about these questions, the responsibility of tech, the responsibility of algorithms that make these decisions, and of course the programmers who program them and set them up for these decisions. So before we get into that, a little bit about myself, who am I and why am I giving this talk. My name is Yechiel. I'm an engineer at VMware, but I wasn't always a programmer. I actually used to be a rabbi and a teacher, used to teach Jewish studies. As a rabbi, of course, I studied Talmud for decades and have been teaching it for almost as long. And even now that I've gone into the field of tech and programming, Talmud study and Jewish studies are still very much a part of my life. I'm part of organizing a Talmud study in my community, a Talmud study group in my community. I still spend a lot of time on it. And that's the perspective that I want to share over here today. Of course, I mentioned the Talmud, so before we go any further, what is the Talmud? Many people have not even heard of it at all. Some have heard vague references, not very clear on it. The Talmud is essentially the written record of the conversations of the sages. It was compiled between the 2nd and 5th century CE. It serves as the primary repository of the law, the legends, and the lore of the Jewish people. And that is the essential focus of rabbinic scholarship until today, really. What's interesting about the Talmud is not just the text. It's not a book that you read and you know it. The Talmud is a living conversation. One of the foremost rabbis of the previous century, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, gave a very fascinating talk where he invoked the imagery where he'd be giving a class to his students, and the door opens up, and the Talmudic sages come in, and the students ask them questions, and they answer, and the students challenge them, and they argue, and they debate back and forth. In a sense, when you learn the Talmud properly, when you get into it, you're not just learning what the sages said years ago. You become a real part of the conversation. In a sense, it's a conversation through the ages. Now, obviously, the Talmud doesn't talk about computers or algorithms or even trolleys for that matter. But Rabbinic Judaism has gotten very adept at applying principles from the Talmud and applying the case law towards modern problems. So, for example, discussions in the Talmud around lighting fire on the Sabbath translate to rulings nowadays about driving cars with combustion engines, for example. Or, for example, discussions around charging interest in the Talmud have actually made their way into bank contracts in Israel these days. So obviously, that's what I'll aim to do through this talk. Obviously, I won't find much about computers, but I will try to look at the different case studies that the rabbis did speak about, and try to rope them into our discussion here and see what they would have to say about our modern day problems. In true Talmudic fashion, we probably won't leave with too many answers, but hopefully we'll be able to rope in the sages to help them clarify to us what are the questions that we should be asking. And after that aside, that leads us to the question that I will be discussing. Am I my algorithm's keeper? And what do I mean by that? So ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've been trying to automate as much of the menial tasks that we've been doing as we possibly could. Of course, this has only accelerated with the advent of computers, and of course with the field of robotics. By now, I'm sure all of us here have robots and computers in our home automating tasks from washing the dishes, cleaning the floor, entertaining our kids and ourselves, giving us information, securing our house, everything. It's only a matter of time before we started trying to automate our decision-making. And in fact, that has already started with different companies and different products that are marketing different machine learning and AI algorithms that aim to solve many of our decision-making processes. Now, in theory, that sounds like a very good idea. Human brains are notoriously buggy. Other people call them features, but these bugs cause many biases and prejudices. And in theory, if we offload that task to a computer, we can remove that fuzziness and replace it with the sterile logic of the zeros and ones and bits and logical operators of our computers. Sounds good. The reality, of course, doesn't work that way. And by automating decisions, what ends up happening a lot of times is that we just automate our biases. For one example, just last year, there was a company that made news, but they've been offering a product that aimed to help companies in the hiring process it would analyze a video of a remote interview, and it would assign the candidate a score based on some machine learning. And that seems good because we know that biases in interviewing and hiring is a huge problem, and it's probably the contributing factor to inequality in tech. So that sounds good. Until a research company came around and started playing around with it, and they realized that the tool was actually very easy to fool by really inconsequential changes. For example, just feeding it the same video and putting a picture on the wall behind the candidate, or changing the background for a bookshelf, automatically assigned a much better score. Obviously, whether you have a bookshelf behind you has nothing to do with how well you're going to do the job. And it probably would tend to discriminate against people who don't have a nice house with a living room with a bookshelf behind them. Or even the lighting. I'm saying the lighting condition also had a huge effect. And obviously, not everyone can have a home office with proper lights. Amazon famously had to pull a tool that they used to analyze resumes after it was discovered to discriminate against candidates who were women. And these problems, these products, okay, they discriminated, but they're just fairly minor. It only affects people's livelihoods and their career progressions. No big deal. But it gets worse. Many courts have been using various algorithms to help judges make decisions around setting who to let out on bail, how much bail to set, or even what kind of sentences to impose. And these algorithms have been already demonstrated to discriminate against suspects who are minorities. And the scary thing is that they're still being used. So the question is, so obviously that's bad. And once self-driving cars and things like that, things that can actually affect people's actual lives, start becoming more popular. So these effects can get even more serious. Now, whenever a company is caught with using an algorithm that's discriminatory or causes any other damage, the first reaction is, hey, it wasn't us. It was the algorithm. The computer made this decision. We have no insight. The algorithm is a black box. We have no insight into why it made the decision it did, but it's a computer. It doesn't have biases. It obviously made that decision for a reason. In other words, they try to offload their responsibility onto the algorithm. The doggy ate my homework. So the question that we're going to look at today and try to get help from the sages is, what is the responsibility of an algorithm? Can an algorithm be held responsible? And who is responsible, in a sense, for the algorithm's decisions? And as I said, as a rabbi, I'll try to approach this from a Talmudic perspective. And thanks for joining me as I think out loud here. Just an aside, many Talmud classes will be quoting a lot of different quotes from the Talmud from different places. Many rabbis and many Talmud teachers will offer a source sheet. I have compiled a source sheet at this URL. You don't have to look it up. Everything will be up on the board. This is if you want to look into it a little deeper later. If you don't memorize this, that's fine. It's going to be at the bottom of each slide. But if you want it, it's there. So let's look at one approach to try to answer this question. And to do that, we will look at a Talmudic concept of the shaliach. A shaliach is, in a sense, a messenger or an agent. And in Talmudic law, an agent is a lot more than just someone who's doing me a favor. The Talmud says that the legal status of an agent is like the person in the cells. If I ask someone to be my agent to execute a sale, it's not that that person made a sale on my behalf. It's as if I made the sale myself. Back in the days before Zoom and things like that, you were able to set an agent to marry a woman on your behalf, and obviously it wasn't the agent's wife, it was yours, or a man, or whatever, husband. So the concept of a shliach, of an agent, is very powerful. So if we consider an algorithm as my agent, if I program an algorithm, set it out into the world, the algorithm would be my agent, that would leave me liable, apparently. But not exactly. The Talmud continues and says that there's a concept that en shliach l'dvar avera, that you can't set an agent to transgress, to do a transgression on your behalf. For example, if I go over to someone and tell them, I'll pay you $100, you'll be my agent to take that guy, take that guy's car, deliver it to my garage. So eventually, that agent, they will be held liable and not me, because that agent has free choice. They're expected to know right from wrong, and therefore, they're not supposed to listen to me. If it's wrong to steal, they're not supposed to steal. In the words of the Talmud, if you have the words of the master and the words of the student, who do you listen to? Or in our terms, if your manager tells you that you should be focusing on one task, and then your teammate says, I think you should focus on the other one, you listen to your manager, because at the end of the day, they're responsible for your paycheck. So in that sense, that would seem similar to the approach that companies have been taking that we mentioned before. They've been offloading the responsibility onto their algorithm and saying, I didn't do it, it was the algorithm. But of course, that reasoning is flawed when we're talking about algorithms, because the concept of that you can't have an agent to do something wrong for you, the reason behind it is because the agent is expected to know right from wrong. They're expected to have the capacity for moral judgment. An algorithm, at least the ones we have these days, before we get to true artificial intelligence, they don't have a concept of right or wrong. They're programmed to make a certain class of decisions, look at a certain class of data, and extrapolate from that to similar decisions. But concepts of right or wrong are way beyond their scope. So obviously, an algorithm cannot be held as an independent agent over here. It would seem like an algorithm would be more like a tool. Sort of like if someone shot an arrow at someone. You can't say, oh, it wasn't me, it was the arrow. And of course, arrows show up a lot in the Talmud. And that's actually pretty fitting for an algorithm, because an arrow works at a distance. It's not a direct me chopping your head off with a machete. I'm working at a distance. Nevertheless, we acknowledge the fact that there is a cause and effect over here. I'm the one who shot the arrow. I'm responsible for its damage. But an algorithm might seem a little more fuzzy than that, because an arrow has a clear trajectory. If I aim at you and I shoot an arrow at you, then we know exactly where the arrow is going to go. Algorithms are a little fuzzier in that even the programmers who program them cannot predict in advance what decisions they will arrive at, what they will end up doing. So it seems like it's a little fuzzier. Maybe there's some randomness. I'm saying ultimately not random, but from the perspective of an outside observer, there seems to be some randomness involved, some unpredictability. But the Talmud deals with a similar case to that. If someone lights a fire in their own yard, and the fire goes on and spreads into their neighbor's yard and burns down their tree, you can't say, hey, I didn't realize it was going to spread that way. Maybe it would have spread in the other direction. Maybe it wouldn't spread at all. No, the Talmud says that a fire is, in fact, the wording it uses, that a fire is like an arrow, and that it's predictable that, if you have a fire, you have wind, the fire is going to spread in the direction of the wind. So the Talmud does compare the two, and even though there is some element of randomness in where and how a fire spread, nevertheless, it's still the general outcome is still predictable, and you are liable. But still, it might be a little different, because like I said, fires are still predictable. It's pretty, if you light a fire next to your neighbor's yard, it's going to get there. There's a law, an edge case in fires, where if I lit a fire and I took all the precautions, I cleared the area around it, I did everything fine, but then an unusually strong wind came around and blew it way beyond what I could have, what average conditions would have allowed. In that case, you're not liable. In that case, you're deemed that it happened sort of an act of God. That's not the term that the Talmud uses, of course. It's something unpredictable. It was not your fault, and you're not liable for that. And someone might argue that the AI that I programmed, it was not, there was no way I could have predicted what it would have done. The AI, in fact, does have some sort of agency. It's making directed decisions that I have no insight into, so maybe I am not liable. Obviously not, it doesn't have the full agency of an agent, of a messenger, because, like we said, it can't differentiate right from wrong, but in its domain, in the domain of the decisions that it's making, it does make its own decisions that are beyond my abilities to predict it. So maybe there's like something between the complete agency of a shliach, of an agent, and the complete lack of agency of a tool, like an arrow or a fire. Maybe there's something in between. And that brings us to the next case study. The Talmud says if someone has a coal, a flame or something, and he hands it over to a child or someone who's cognitively impaired, either he's drunk or whatever, and that person takes the fire and goes somewhere else and causes some damage. In that case, the Talmud rules that that person is exempt by human laws, but is liable in the laws of heaven, according to the laws of heaven. Now, that concept, someone who's exempt by human laws but liable by the laws of heaven, it's a ruling employed by the Talmud in cases where something might be technically legal, but morally wrong. So a human court can't convict you on that because, for whatever reason, in this case, because you weren't the one who caused the damage, of course. But it was still wrong because you knew what you were doing. You were handing it to someone who cannot make their own decisions. So perhaps, maybe this is the middle ground that we're looking for, where an artificial intelligence would land. Maybe a company that deploys such an algorithm would be on the technically legal end of the spectrum, but still obviously morally questionable, and we would expect them to do their due diligence and ensure that the technology they're using is not causing any harm. So, like I said, I don't have the answers yet. I would probably lean a little more than this. I'd probably lean more towards the direction of placing responsibility on the companies. But again, these are discussions that we need to start having, because the days where such questions were just the realm of theoretical philosophers are well behind us. They're already describing our real world that we live in already today. Now, whenever we start thinking about such thorny issues and such thorny questions, and eventually, at some point, we think, what can I do already? Like, I'm just, I'm an individual contributor. I'm working on my product, what I'm doing. I can't affect decisions on a company-wide scale, never mind on a worldwide scale. Why should I bother discussing, thinking about these questions and having these discussions? And that leads me to one of my favorite Talmudic quotes. Rabbi Tarfon said that it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it. In other words, this work may be bigger than each of us individually, but that doesn't absolve us from actually doing that work. If you take a moment to think about all the big projects that humanity has embarked on, landing a man on the moon, building a huge laboratory up in space, huge skyscrapers, massive dams, infrastructure projects, amazing computer languages. What all these projects have in common is they were not made by, there was no one single person who made these things. They were all the culmination of hard work by tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, architects, construction workers, even, tens of thousands of people worked on each, hundreds of thousands of people. Obviously, the work was much bigger than each of those workers on their own, yet it couldn't have been done without each and every one of their contributions. And in a similar way, we are all part of the biggest construction project to move the world along, to make it a better place, to leave it better than we found it. And overall, the world, we like to think, is moving in the right direction. Yet it's not going to move there without each of us doing our part. The work might be much bigger than each of us individually, but nevertheless, we each need to do our part to leave the world a little better than the way it was when we left it. So, if anyone has any questions, looks like we still have time. And if not, then I'm around for the rest of the conference, which isn't that much longer, but I'm always available and found online at Yechiel K on Twitter. I have my email address if that's easier for you. Just a brief shameless promotion. If you're interested in questions about if this intersection between Talmud, religion, ethics, and technology interests you, I have a weekly newsletter together with a friend of mine, Ben Greenberg, where we discuss these topics on a weekly basis. We have a small Discord community. You can find it on torrentech.dev. Thank you so much. Yeah? Sorry?
Do you think we're morally obligated to leave a job where they're doing things that we don't agree with?
Good question. Repeat it for the camera. Are we morally obligated to leave a job where they're doing things that we morally don't agree with? And that's obviously not an easy question to answer because being able to leave a job is a privilege, and not everyone could just drop their job. On the other hand, doing things that are, very big atrocities were done by people who were doing their job. And I guess ultimately it would be a decision that you have to make for yourself, seeing first of all how questionable the things you're doing is, and how privileged you are to be able to drop that and leave it. Obviously, in an ideal world, everyone would be able to make that decision and just leave them, but the world is not black and white. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah?
Do you think from a Talmudic perspective, you're more responsible to encourage positive change rather than remove yourself from the situation that you find morally and
Yeah.
your own morals?
That's a great question. So the question was, from a Talmudic perspective, is it better for you to stay on board and try to affect change from within rather than leave and in protest? And again, that's probably not black and white. It really depends. I'm saying it depends on how much change you could. If you could, if you're fairly high up and senior in the company, and you know that people will be listening to your opinion, and you are able to change the trajectory of the company, then by all means, that would be perfect. That would be the best possible outcome. Would you be able to make an effect to change things on a grassroots level? Can you start up conversation among other employees and get help folks organize and collectively work, it would depend on the effect that you believe you can have realistically, I guess, and the factors that we spoke about in answer to the last question. Yes?
Are there any trends in tech that you find more worrying than others currently?
So the question was, are there any trends that I find more worrying than others? So again, we're moving very fast, a lot faster, I believe, than people have anticipated, and we've anticipated that we'll be moving fast. So, so yeah, the fact that we're going so fast, we've been so preoccupied with whether we could, and we haven't paused to ask if we should. So yeah, the fact that we are moving so quickly and not having these conversations on a global level sounds pretty worrying, and I really hope that that turns around quickly. All right, so if that's it, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.